This is accommodation, accessibility, and access. We've met before. I'm Dave. I'm the instructional designer here in the Faculty Success Center for the next couple of weeks anyway. Sort of what the instructional designer does and what the instructional designer will do going forward is where Molly and David really focus on the technical and Canvas aspect sort of things. I help with curriculum development, helping faculty and staff develop accessible materials, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to talk today about accommodation, accessibility, and access, and sort of how all three of those terms fit together and how we can use them to develop the most balanced and equitable learning experiences for the widest variety of learners we can. We'll talk about the differences between those terms, what groups of people are involved in each part of that process, and how we can use those to build out learning environments to take advantage of all three of these areas. So I want to start with just having and developing an understanding of the idea that this stuff is really complicated, right? It's challenging. There's a lot to it. And so it's perfectly normal to feel confused about the terms and process. It's normal to feel apprehensive about doing a lot of this work. It's normal to feel overwhelmed. It's normal to think that you're just not going to have time to do all this stuff. And so the quotes that I have here on the screen are things that I've heard from various faculty members and stakeholders over the years I've been doing this. So before I was here at Valley, I was at Spring Arbor University for 3 years, and I did a lot of accessibility and universal design work there too. So if you're having some of these thoughts, it's perfectly normal. You're not alone, right? I've heard, I don't have time to do all this work that just benefits a few learners. I think some learners are trying to game the system, so I don't want to do some of these accommodations or do some of this work. I'll deal with this when I have a student that has a disability. I'm afraid I'm going to do or say something wrong and either offend someone or get myself or the college sued. This is one that I hear quite a bit. I don't know how to make the learning experience more equitable for all learners. And there's a lot of conflicting information out there. And this one is a pretty common refrain too. There's a lot of different tactics and strategies and ways that different people will say is the right way to approach this stuff. And so there's a lot of information out there that it's really difficult to sort through. And then the other big one that I hear is I'm concerned about building in some of these features, dumbing down or sort of reducing the academic rigor of my course. And it's important to realize that that's never what we're trying to do. All we're trying to do is to make the educational and the learning experience that you're creating more equitable and more accessible to a wide variety of learners. We're not trying to reduce the rigor of the content at all. And I also want to emphasize really that this is a process that we're all still learning, right? I've been doing this work for a few years now, and I'm still learning more about it every day. There are things that come up all the time that I still have to research. It's a comparatively new field in a lot of ways, particularly when it comes to web and digital accessibility. Things are always changing. It's okay to be confused. It's okay to be apprehensive. It's okay to be overwhelmed. So as you're walking through and as you're doing some of this, have some empathy with yourself, have some empathy with your learners, and just try to go easy on it if you don't get it or can't do everything right away. And we'll talk about some strategies later on how to sort of reduce some of that burden so it's not quite so overwhelming and confusing. So the first thing we need to establish then is, why do we do this type of accommodation and accessibility and access work? So there's a quote that sums it up nicely, and this is from a book that I highly, highly recommend called Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone, Universal Design for Learning in Higher Education. And it's by Tom Tobin, and there's another author, and I forget the other author's name off the top of my head. But the quote is, we are in the business of removing barriers by providing choices. And so that's really what a lot of this work is about. It's about helping our learners to succeed by removing barriers to their learning wherever they might encounter those barriers. And the research shows us that when we remove those barriers, we increase retention, right? Students are more likely to, after they've finished a course, come back for more courses at the same institution in the future. We also increase persistence. Students are likely to stick with a class or a learning experience, particularly if it's challenging, once they've started it, rather than dropping out of a class a few weeks into the semester. They're also more likely to express satisfaction with the learning experience. Professors who implement UDL strategies generally get much higher reviews on course evaluations when those types of things are implemented. So not only are the things we're talking about and doing here, not only are they good for the students, but they're also good for faculty and for the institution as well. So a few statistics here, because I like numbers and I think numbers are interesting. 11% of undergraduate students have some sort of disability that interferes with their learning. Now, that gets really interesting when you couple it with another number, which is that 60 to 80% of those who have a barrier or a disability don't report that. And that could be for a variety of reasons, right? Maybe they don't want to appear to be a burden to their faculty member. Maybe they don't want to publicly identify their disability. Maybe they just don't know that there are resources and tools available to them that they can get help, or they don't know how to access those resources. And so they struggle doing the best they can with no help at all. So one of the big reasons why we do the accessibility work and do the access work up front is to help that sort of 60 to 80% of people who aren't reporting the help that they need. Another thing is that 10% of Americans don't have broadband internet access. And a large percentage of folks, their primary internet connection is through something like a smartphone. And that's not an accessibility issue. We don't typically phrase it in that way, but it is an access issue. If you have a course that's full of high resolution video or has a whole lot of interactive elements that students need to download, one of the things you want to keep in mind is how is a student who doesn't have broadband access going to access that learning content or that educational context? And then 74% of learners, and this is a huge one here for us at Valley, have at least what we would call one non-traditional characteristic. And that can be anything from being anywhere outside the sort of traditional 18 to 22 age range for an undergraduate student. Maybe it's working a full-time job out of school. Maybe it's having kids. Maybe it's being a member of a racial or ethnic minority, or any number of other things. And sort of each of these groups of learners has their own set of barriers that they encounter that makes learning more challenging for them. And so what we're trying to do when we're designing for access is to design in such a way to eliminate as many of those barriers as possible.